The story begins in 1922 with Mr. and Mrs. Twant, who were spending their vacation in Hong Kong. While walking through one of the Chinese districts, they found a fortune teller surrounded by many people. Mrs. Twant, curious, persuaded her husband to try and see their future. Reluctantly, Mr. Twant agreed, and they both waited for their turn. As soon as they sat with the fortune teller, she looked at Mr. Twant and told him that he would not live past the age of 30. Mrs. Twant became anxious, but Mr. Twant disregarded the fortune teller's words and asked his wife to leave, refusing to pay the fortune teller any money. Before they left, she told him that no man from the place they came from would live past the age of 30. Mr. Twant scoffed at the fortune teller's words because the village where he and his wife lived had hundreds of men who were over the age of 30. After the vacation, Mr. and Mrs. Twant returned to their home in India. Years passed without Mr. or Mrs. Twant having any children, but Mrs. Twant kept thinking about the fortune teller's words with every birthday that passed for her husband. A week before Mr. Twant's birthday, she had to travel to her family in another village, got busy with them, and forgot her worries about her husband. On his birthday, Mrs. Twant returned to her husband's home to find him hanging in the entrance of the house, strangled with an electrical cord wrapped around his neck. When the police arrived, they found a strange letter in Mr. Twant's pocket stating that he had lived a week of fear and terror in the house, hearing the sounds of trees being cut around the house, seeing a black cat appearing and disappearing in the living room, and hearing knocking sounds throughout the house all night. He wrote that he could no longer bear it and decided to end his life. After confirming that her husband had committed suicide, Mrs. Twant decided to leave the house and return to live with her family after the tragedy that befell her husband. Years passed on the deserted house until an English family consisting of Mrs. Rosemary, her father, grandfather, and husband arrived in the city. After extensive searching, they settled on the deserted house, which was spacious, sprawling with rooms, and had a large garden. Mrs. Rosemary's family was delighted with the new house, suitable for all of them. Despite the legends surrounding the house, Rosemary and her family considered themselves educated and cultured, refusing to believe the majority of Indians who were uneducated. After 1 month, Rosemary's husband and her brother began working in agriculture. Rosemary was busy researching English families living in the same city. Meanwhile, her grandfather and father were alone in the house. Suddenly, they began to hear knocking sounds everywhere in the house, until they noticed that the furniture was moving on its own, even though there was no one else in the house. The father and grandfather were disturbed by what was happening and waited for the rest of the family to arrive to tell them what happened. However, no one in the family believed them. As days passed, the grandfather and father kept hearing the same sounds until they decided to mark the floor under the furniture with chalk to prove to the rest of the family that they were not insane. Indeed, they marked under the furniture chairs with chalk and waited. Soon after, they heard a strange noise coming from the furniture room. The father went down, followed by the grandfather, who was holding a lantern. Suddenly, a black cat emerged from the darkness and jumped on them both, causing the grandfather to fall down the stairs heavily, and the lantern fell from his hand, breaking on Rosemary's father, who fell behind him. The noise of the scream woke the entire family, who found the grandfather lying on the stairs bleeding and the father screaming from the heat of the lantern. The family rushed the grandfather and father to the hospital, but the grandfather died of a heart attack, and the father lived with his face and neck completely disfigured. After a while, the family resumed their activities, and the father was left alone in the house. One day, Rosemary returned to find her father hanging in the entrance with a rope wrapped around his neck. Rosemary's family, who had lost 2 members in less than a month, was devastated. Rosemary began to feel pessimistic about the house, and after initially welcoming guests and visitors, the entire town began to fear entering the house. Rosemary decided to move from the house and the city altogether, but her husband refused due to his stable job and ability to find work. Rosemary was forced to try to adapt to living in the house. One day, Rosemary's husband returned screaming, telling her that her brother had died. Indeed, Rosemary's brother died after the tractor he was working with went out of control and crushed him underneath. Thus, Rosemary lost her entire family, leaving her with only her husband. She tried to distract herself from the tragedy that had befallen her until she decided to find out what happened to the family that lived in the house before them. Rosemary learned the name of the previous house occupants, Mr. and Mrs. Twant, and decided to travel to the Twant village to learn their story. Rosemary arrived at the Twant's house, where she found Mrs. Twant aged and showing signs of old age. She asked her to tell her what had happened in the house. To reassure her, Rosemary shared the tragedy that had befallen her family. Mrs. Twant, initially reluctant, was moved and told Rosemary about the fortune teller who had said that no man would live past the age of 30 from their place of origin. Rosemary realized that her husband was next after all her relatives who had passed the age of 30 died in strange ways. She hurried back home, pleading with her husband to sell the house and leave. After much persuasion, Rosemary's husband agreed and began to offer the house for sale. However, strangely, no one from the village agreed to buy it. Rosemary decided that she and her husband would leave until the house was sold. They entrusted the house to a broker in the village and returned to their home country, England. Years passed, and the house remained deserted as it was, until it was purchased by a wealthy Englishman to serve as housing for migrant workers who would work in his vineyards and apple orchards. On September 5, 1945, 8 workers of various nationalities, including Indians, Filipinos, and Mexicans, arrived in the city and lived in the house owned by Mr. Herbert. Most of the workers were between the ages of 15 and 25. Unfortunately, among the workers was a 30-year-old Filipino named Eddie, chosen for his slim body and physical strength. Eddie was a simple worker, dreaming of a difficult future after knowing the pay he would receive after harvesting the fruits, especially after hearing about Mr. Herb's generosity, who had fought in the Philippines and had a special love for them. Mr. Herb began to treat Eddie preferentially, allowing him to call him by his name without titles. Days passed, and Eddie worked with the other workers until one day he felt severe pain in his right shoulder. Eddie didn't understand what suddenly happened, despite having done much more work before without getting tired. He decided to go to the farm to take a leave. Struggling to dress, Eddie suddenly began to hear knocking sounds everywhere in the house. Thinking someone was knocking on the door, he went down to open it, but found no one. Eddie re-entered the house, looking around, and suddenly found a large, muscular, bald man appearing to be in his 30s in front of him. Eddie was startled and asked who he was, but the man suddenly disappeared from his sight. Eddie was puzzled, thinking he was suffering from fever, causing hallucinations with the pain he felt. He left the house, got into his car, and went to the farm. There, he asked the manager for sick leave to see a doctor. In the clinic, Eddie learned that he was suffering from rheumatic pain and would get better once he started treatment. He decided to extend his leave and stay at home. On his first night alone, as the other workers were up late at the farm, Eddie slept and suddenly began to dream of nightmares about the same man he had seen in the living room, hanging himself at the entrance of the house. Eddie woke up, drenched in sweat from the horror of the scene he had seen. But suddenly he heard a noise coming from the living room. Eddie quietly sneaked in to see the same person he had seen in his nightmare, and earlier that day, sitting surrounded by files and papers, tearing them up. Eddie approached and asked who he was, but suddenly the lights went out and yellow eyes appeared in the darkness. Eddie moved closer, overwhelmed by fear, until he heard a cat's sound. Suddenly, he saw it moving randomly among the furniture until it completely disappeared. Eddie stood alone in the middle of the wide house, not understanding what was happening. However, he tried to reassure himself that what happened was just hallucinations caused by the nightmare he had seen, and went back to sleep. Day by day, Eddie continued to dream the same dream and hear the same sounds, not understanding what was happening, until the day he turned 30. As with all those before him, the workers found him hanging at the entrance of the house with a medical band wrapped around his neck and hanging from the ceiling. The reputation of the house worsened, and all the townspeople knew that anyone who entered the house would not leave it unless they were younger than 30 years old. Years passed, and the deserted house remained as it was until the story was forgotten, and new generations who had not seen anything with their own eyes came along. The house was sold in 1980 to a senior man named Vasant Kshetri, who worked as a civil servant and lived there with his young children after his wife's death. A week later, their cousin Clement decided to visit them in their new home and spend the summer vacation with them. One day, while Clement was sitting in the garden reading a book, he felt a heaviness in the air above him. He looked up to see a large, bald-headed man watching him, who suddenly vanished into the air. Clement was puzzled by what was happening, but guessed that his eyes had deceived him due to the intense sunlight and considered it a trick. Day after day, Clement kept seeing the same person watching him, so he decided to name the mysterious figure Charlie and told his uncle and cousins about him. His cousin Dinkar confessed that he had seen the same person since they came to the house and described Charlie with the same characteristics Clement had seen. Afterward, The rest of the family began to admit that they were seeing the same person. However, Uncle Vincent did not believe his children and nephew, attributing what happened to the intense heat of the sun, which could cause them hallucinations. One day, the family heard Vincent screaming from his bedroom. They all gathered around the source of the noise. Vincent told them he saw the same person they described standing in front of his bed, watching him, but he disappeared completely as soon as he screamed. The figure was bald, large-bodied, wearing a red and black sarong and a white shirt. Vincent's children tried to calm him down until he realized that he should not believe in ghosts, assuring them that he was surely dreaming of a nightmare, nothing more. Days passed, and it was Uncle Vincent's habit to keep important papers in the office located in the house. One day, Uncle Vincent came back and tried to open his desk to take out some of his papers, but was unable to open it at all. Everyone tried to help, but to no avail. The next day, they called a locksmith to open the desk. After changing the locks, the locksmith handed Uncle Vincent the keys, locked the desk, and left. Uncle Vincent confirmed the desk was locked and the keys were working, and went to his job as usual. The rest of the children went out to play and hang out. When they returned, they found all the files and papers that were in the desk scattered everywhere in the room. Everyone was puzzled about how the box, which opens with a key, and everyone tried to open, could be opened so easily, despite all windows and doors being locked. Here, Clement began to feel that something strange was happening in Uncle Vincent's house. One day, while everyone was sitting at home, they heard the sound of furniture moving from the living room. Clement and his cousins joked, describing Charlie as liking to rearrange the furniture and annoy Uncle Vincent. But deep inside, they were sure that there was an evil spirit in the house, especially because of the dog, Reaper, who sometimes barked loudly and whined a lot, as if afraid of something. The strange noises continued in the house. Uncle Vincent decided to find out the reason for the furniture moving. He tried to mark the places where he put the chairs until he noticed a chalk mark drawn on the floor. He got the same idea and decided to draw with chalk on the places where the table and chairs were. Standing on the ladder with a heavy wooden stick in his hand, the same scene was repeated. The furniture indeed moved, and suddenly a huge black cat appeared from the darkness. But fortunately, Uncle Vincent managed to keep his nerves, and the cat disappeared completely. Everyone started to notice the decline in Uncle Vincent's health, until one day, Dinkar returned home late and, upon opening the door, found his father standing on a chair, putting a noose around his neck. Dinkar screamed in shock, calling for his siblings in disbelief at what their father was doing. They managed to save him at the last moment. Finally, the family decided to leave the house and return to their country. The family packed their bags, and Clement decided to visit one of his university friends nearby until the rest of the family was ready. On the way, Clement saw a man signaling to him from afar, standing alone on the road. Clement stopped his car to give him a ride to the desired location, and suddenly, he saw the same man he sees as Charlie. Clement felt shocked, as if he had lost all his senses, and kept driving for hours, not knowing where he was going. Suddenly, Clement stopped the car after gathering his strength and quickly got out to open the back door. As soon as he opened it, he found a huge black cat jumping from the car and disappearing into the bushes by the road. Clement collapsed and quickly got back into his car to return to his uncle and cousins. But as soon as he arrived, he found a huge crowd of townspeople and police everywhere, and his cousins were transferring their father's body after he had hanged himself and died. 10 years later, Clement graduated from engineering college and worked as a civil engineer in the public works department. By coincidence, his uncle's house was assigned for workers and engineers for a one-week stay. Clement decided to uncover the secret of Charlie's evil spirit, which had caused his uncle's death, and the sad memories that haunted him over the years. He decided not to sleep in the house until he discovered the secret. He consulted his friend, Mohammed Khan, who had experience in telepathy and clairvoyance, and told him the mysterious story of his uncle's house and the legends he had heard about it before his uncle moved in. Mohammed Khan decided to interview about 20 elderly people living in the city until he reached the city's own records and found out who the first owner was. In the early 1930s, a man named Mr. Eyre worked as a tax collector. Eyre was a large, muscular, bald man with dark skin who was single. One day, the townspeople discovered that Mr. Eyre was stealing their money under the pretext of collecting taxes. Eyre fled to the cursed house with his black cat and papers and decided to burn his face so no one could recognize him. However, government men managed to reach him, and the angry townspeople gathered around the house for stealing their money. Eyre locked all the doors and windows until he reached the last door, and at the last moment, one of the townspeople began to hit the door with an axe. Eyre was injured in his arm and felt severe pain. Quickly, he gathered all the papers and files while bleeding and cut them all. He had prepared a noose at the entrance of the house to hang himself before the townspeople could reach him and kill him in a more violent manner. Amidst the angry shouts of the townspeople and their banging on the walls of the house and the sounds of axes and saws trying to open the doors and windows, Mr. Eyre shot his black cat and then hanged himself at the entrance of the house. Mr. Eyre died before he turned 30 years old. A year later, Mr. Eyre's innocence was proven regarding the charges against him, and the townspeople discovered he was innocent. To live with the guilt, they agreed not to tell the story to their children, and the story was buried in the records. Clement heard the story and understood everything he had been seeing and hearing. Mohammed Khan told him that he could help in isolating Charlie from the house. On the 10th of July, Mohammed went with Clement to the house, carrying a bottle of whiskey and a worn-out tiger skin. He sat at the living room table, legs crossed, wearing the tiger skin, and placed the bottle in front of him. He asked Clement to sit quietly. Mohammed recited strange words for half an hour. Suddenly, he screamed aggressively, quickly closed the bottle, smiled at Clement, and told him that he had trapped Mr. Eyre's spirit inside the bottle. Afterward, he asked for his help to move the bottle. Although it was empty, it was very heavy to the extent that they required assistance from a third person. The three of them carried the bottle and buried it in a small hole near the house. The legend of Mr. Eyre ended, and Clement was able to sleep in the house for the first time in peace and quiet.